Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we are going to talk about self-centeredness, which can certainly be tied into the ego, and how that can contrast with self-awareness. And the idea for this actually came from a book, Inner Excellence by Jim Murphy, which I'm currently reading, and which actually got a lot of publicity just a couple of months ago, when AJ Brown from the Super Bowl winning Philadelphia Eagles was seen reading this during a game on the sidelines, flipping through the pages during a game. And this book has a lot of different themes on the mental side of the game, sports psychology themes. But I think this idea of sort of contrasting the ego or self-centeredness from self-awareness, I think is a really interesting point, and how we can, how we can come to understand these two ideas, and then also how that fits into failure, and maybe how people view failure. And we can, I think, certainly bring up some examples of athletes that have found maybe more productive or healthier ways to view failure. So yeah, Brian, wanted to see, sort of as a starting point, what some of your thoughts on this topic, or on some of those concepts of self-centeredness, ego, and self-awareness. I wanted to see some of your initial thoughts.
Let's start with self-centeredness. So when I read that passage, Josh, I was immediately, I thought of ego right away. And ego is a kind of an abstract concept. So let's put a definition to it. And when we're thinking about self-centeredness, I like Ryan Holiday's definition. So Ryan Holiday writes a lot about Stoic philosophy. And in his book, Ego is the Enemy, he defined ego, for the way he wanted to talk about it in his book, as an unhealthy belief in your own importance. And when I hear unhealthy, it doesn't necessarily mean like we're being arrogant about it, although that could be part of the ego. But some of it also comes from perhaps insecurity about who you are, and the need to validate yourself through outside results or praise, things out of your control. And I think that that's a bit of what Jim Murphy is really talking about here. It could be arrogance, but it also could be the fact that we don't really fully believe in ourselves yet. And I think as we, all grow up in sport and in life, we all, I think, hit this stage. It's kind of a rite of passage that we have to get to this place of, how do I feel about myself? How do I feel about my abilities? How do I know I'm any good? That's actually one of the things that many junior tennis players struggle with, is this notion of, am I good enough? Or I'm not good enough. So, like I said, I think this is like a necessary stage that we have to go through. And then, the author then brings us through, all right, how do we begin to deal with this, and how can we create better perspectives on. I want to definitely get into more about failure and that word. We've discussed it in the past, but I want to get deeper into that and learn to adopt ways of thinking here that promote more mastery and learning, as opposed to the need to win, or the need to have some sort of achievement that is really only serving to validate who you are. And we talked about in the paradox of the ego, this notion of letting go of the ego. But of course, you can't let go of the ego until you have built a strong sense of who you are. And I think that's where the process is. And I think it's good for all the listeners to maybe take stock. Where am I in that process? And hopefully over the course of this episode, we'll help people kind of understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, and as I think you touched on a little bit, we covered this topic from sort of a different angle in episode 202, so not too long ago, just a few months ago, where we talked about the paradox of the ego, just like you're referencing, where sometimes it requires you to go through that process of actually having an ego, of maybe being really tied to your outcomes and results, to understand that there's maybe a different path forward, that there's maybe a better path forward. And I think the way that I will often try to explain it to people is that no matter how high of a level you achieve in your sport, and you could be best in the world, there are always ups and downs. There are always ups and downs. Nobody plays their best every single day. Nobody wins every time. So if we are tying our self-worth and tying our ego to our results, then in a certain way, we are really setting ourselves up for disappointment, for frustration, because it's not going to be the way that we want it to be each time we're out there. There will be times where we're great. There will be times where we're less than our best. And if we're constantly tying that to our worth as a person, and and putting too much stock in that, then we're setting ourselves up to not think much of ourselves, or to at the very least, have a inconsistent or unstable feeling about ourselves and about our progress. Where we could talk about different things to focus on instead. Being more process focused, having more of a mastery orientation, focusing more on excellence, things like this, which I think not only are they more sustainable because we can work to get better every day and track our progress in that way, but I think it's more within our control. So I think it's more controllable and more sustainable in a lot of ways. So I think for different reasons, the ego, or sort of this idea of being self-centered, is a trap, but it might be a necessary trap to sort of overcome that in order to approach things in an ultimately better way.
Right, because I think life is like an obstacle course of different lessons we need to learn, sort of like a Spartan race. And many of us will run into some of the same obstacles. Many of us will also have unique ones. And we see
Yep.
that, with the players that we work with, Josh. Many who probably come to us with the exact same thing they're experiencing. And then every now and then you'll get somebody who's a little bit different. And, they've maybe taken a different path. But I think from a human perspective, this is one that we all go through. And I think trap is a good word, because not everybody gets out of the trap. Some people remain in that trap for a long, long time. And, how do we get out of the trap? How do we learn that? And I think that's a little bit of what is covered, in this book, this notion of self-centeredness versus self-awareness. So can you cover, because you've read more of this book than I have, can you cover what he means by self-awareness as a means of dealing with this sort of self-centered, egocentric view of performance?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I would say the way that I would describe it is, he talks about self-centeredness as, yeah, being very ego focused and very outcome focused. He gives an example of somebody who maybe gives a presentation or a talk and doesn't feel like it goes so well. And from a ego perspective, they are so focused just on that outcome, just on that end result, saying, "Oh, I'm such a failure. Um, everybody's judging me. I'm never going to make it as a public speaker. Why should I even keep trying?" And contrast that with more of a self-aware vantage point, where yes, maybe there's still some frustration about the talk or presentation not going as well, but there's also that awareness of why. There's the awareness that, okay, maybe I could have prepared more. There's the awareness of, you know what, maybe I didn't handle the pressure as well during certain key moments of that talk. Maybe I could have, prepared for the actual content of the talk, and maybe prepared myself mentally as well for what I might be experiencing out there. So it's more, I think that that second piece, or that second option, we can say, of self awareness is, it brings in different aspects of, instead of just focusing on the outcome, which obviously, even if we focus on the process and sort of how we get there, there's still going to be some, I guess we could say, awareness of the outcome. But we are also focusing on, you know, everything that leads up to that point, how we are approaching the situation, how we're feeling, the thoughts going through our heads. We're taking more of a comprehensive approach to our performance than just that obsession on results and sort of identifying too much with those results themselves.
And I think part of the development of self awareness is the ability to, in a way, step outside of yourself and see it almost from like a third person perspective of like what happened there.
Yep.
And um, when you can do that, then, like you just said, Josh, you're not over identifying with the performance. You're not connecting your self worth to, yeah, that was a horrible presentation or that was a horrible match. Therefore, I'm not a good player. You can take a look at it. And I think we've discussed these questions a few times here, but reflection questions. And also a little bit more from Dr. Richard Young, who studies a lot of Olympic athletes. He works with a lot of Olympic athletes, what we'll call oversight questions. Both of these can really help when you're trying to step outside of yourself and be more self aware. So the typical reflection questions of, all right, what went well? What needs work? What did I learn through this process? Right? And you might have learned, okay, you suck at presentations. You need to do a few things better, or you're not handling pressure matches as well as you could. All right, so we've learned that. Maybe that's what needs work. The oversight questions are looking more at the overall process of preparation and recovery and performance. And it's like, what do I need to continue doing? So, what's working? What do I need to stop doing? What's not working for me to enable performance? And then finally, what do I need to start doing in order to enable my systems to be really good? And just going through those questions in a very honest way, in a very objective way, can start to build some of that self awareness and help you detach from that result. I think if we think about a really good Buddhist concept, Josh, impermanence. This loss is not a permanent thing. It does not mean you are always going to be a bad player. Not even a bad player. You're on a journey, you're on a path. Things change. And the more that we can understand that this result is not a permanent thing, it is not a fatal thing, it isn't condemning you to any sort of life in tennis. No match will determine your future. You get to determine that based on how you process it and what you decide to do next. So I think in developing self-awareness, we're developing this idea of, how do I respond to what is happening in my life, and not so much needing to identify with everything that happens in life. Because if we go back to like when we were all children learning to walk, imagine, because the ego isn't quite as developed cognitively then. We're not really, haven't been introduced to this concept or even understand this concept of judging yourself. But I think if we had, a large percentage of us would still be crawling around on all fours. We wouldn't have learned to walk because what invariably happens is a baby tries to walk and they're pretty shaky and often fall down. Yep. And imagine if they said in that moment, oh, I'm never going to learn to walk. I'm the worst at this. They're just going to stay on the floor, right? But we all learned it. So it is within us to be able to persevere through these things because the majority of us are standing upright on 2 feet. So we have done this before. Can we tap into that bit of wisdom and knowledge that our younger selves had more intuitively? And maybe it's because they hadn't learned some bad habits about judging ourselves or feeling judged by others. So I think this self awareness is really key. It's the way out of the trap, learning to develop that. Um, I'm not sure if this is mentioned in the book, Josh. I think it might be. But mindfulness is also a means of developing that self awareness and developing that ability to watch yourself, kind of step away a bit, almost seeing what you're doing again, a third person perspective. We've also talked about the coach's voice being similar to kind of step away from yourself and speak to yourself in the second person. So I think, yeah, we've discussed a lot of tools about developing self-awareness, but this is the way through that trap. If you're noticing this idea of I have to win in order to feel good, or I have to achieve a certain ranking or a rating, then all the work has been worth it. If you're going to choose to define success that way, that's completely up to you. But you are probably setting yourself up for more psychological trouble going forward.
Yeah, I would say that another key difference is that self-awareness is more objective, right? Self-awareness is, you know, our ability to, as you said, kind of take a step back, but to, yeah, just simply notice or observe the situation, right? Where we're noticing, we're noticing things that have happened, things that are happening currently in the moment, right? Trying to um, have that focus on the present moment, which certainly relates to mindfulness. But yeah, I mean, in the case of, let's say, that presentation, there is that awareness of the past, right? We are able to simply notice or observe what actually happened in that last point, but we're taking an objective approach. And again, you could, in that last presentation, we're taking an objective approach, and the same can be done, let's say, in a tennis match between points. Can you take that objective approach and just kind of notice what actually happened in that last point? Can you sort of zoom in on it and just notice sort of the facts of the situation instead of constant judgment, right? Which is also a Buddhist principle, this non judgment, being able to, and instead, I think what people often do is they do judge a situation. They judge a situation or they critique a situation. They'll say, "Oh, that was that was a horrible that was a horrible presentation, or that was a horrible pointer. How could you miss that shot? That was so easy." Right? Or things like that. And instead of being objective, just observing, just noticing, again, sort of the facts of what actually happened in that situation, or in the past situation, or a situation that's happening currently, we bring our own emotions and judgment and critiques into a moment. And, and then we define ourselves based on that. We define ourselves based on whether that moment went quote unquote well or not. And then we're either a success, or not only was the point or the situation was the point or the situation a success or a failure, we are now a success or failure based on that. But guess what? Even if we view ourselves as a success right now because that we won that last point, or that last situation went well for us, that's not going to last. That is impermanent as well, right? There's the thing about tennis and life is there's another point coming and there's another situation coming. So maybe the next situation you win it again, but soon enough you will lose that next point, or a situation will go not your will not go your way. And then, instead of viewing yourself as this big success, you're viewing yourself as a failure and sort of seeing yourself in that way. And again, maybe then that following point is a success, and you can sort of ride the ups and downs of that. But there certainly is a more sustainable and a more sustainable approach. But I think it, when we talk about sort of overcoming that ego, I think part of the awareness piece is the awareness of the ego and the awareness of that sort of process taking place, and of us putting too much importance on results and over identifying with them at times.
So before we move on to talk more about success, failure, feedback, different definitions of that, let's take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Go Sports. So this episode is sponsored by Go Sports. It's GEAU sport.com. So Go Sports, a family-owned business in the U.S. They specialize entirely on gear bags, so racket bags, duffel bags, backpacks, all made with really high-quality premium fabrics and materials. So the same materials that are used in premium outdoor products are used in the Go Sport bags. And they are rigorously tested for long-term use and great design. Both Josh and I have the Axiom 9 racket bag. Really enjoying that, Josh. So any thoughts from you today about recent usage of your bag?
Yeah, it's been great. I would say it's definitely the best bag I've ever used. I find it very comfortable. I find that it's thoughtfully designed, I guess we could say, where it just makes sense where things are located, where there's a clear place for my rackets, there's a clear place for where I might keep over grips and string, and where I can put my phone, wallet, and keys, and clean, a clean set of clothes or dirty clothes. And there's because of because of all the different compartments and different sections, it feels like everything has a place. And I think both during training and during matches, that gives me a certain peace of mind that I don't have to worry about trying to find things, and I know where things are. And and it's just clearly a well designed, sturdy bag that I know I'll be using for a long time.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I've used it the last few weeks a lot more, playing a lot more tennis, and just feels like there's more room in it because of the way it's designed. And it
Yep.
is definitely one of the best bags I've ever owned. So, as a Tennis IQ podcast listener, you can enjoy a 10% discount on Go Sport products at gosport.com. So it's GEAU sport.com. And the discount code is TennisIQ10. You can also find that in the show notes if I don't have a chance to write that down. So please visit gosport.com today, GEAU sport.com. Okay, Josh, so let's jump back into talking about success and failure. There are, I think, some very good perspectives from some notable professional athletes with respect to failure. Does it exist in sports? Does it not exist? Um, and I guess it's all based on what you choose to emphasize, right? So I'd love to hear, your thoughts on, especially from the book, because I think the author here says that there is no feedback. I'm sorry, there is no failure. There is only feedback. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is required for that sort of approach is to redefine failure, right? I think for a lot of people, almost, I would say maybe the default in our society is that winning is success and losing is failure, right? If I won that match, okay, that means I am the champion of this match. That means I'm a winner. I've done everything well, and if I'm a failure, then that means the exact opposite. Um, and I think we need to be able to take a step back from that approach. And we can. I think they give the example of two runners who run a race, right? One of which who's set world records, let's say, and has had a lot of success. Has historically been a top runner, and the other who's less experienced. And they run the race, and the more experienced runner does not have their best day. And in fact, they win, but they barely win. They barely win the race by mere seconds or milliseconds. And the other runner who's less experienced has a PR and has, their best race of all time. But the more experienced runner ended up winning, quote unquote, winning the race, was a success in that race, and the other one lost it. But really, who ought to feel better about their result? Is it the more experienced runner who didn't do their best, didn't do their best on that particular day, you know, we could say underperformed, underachieved compared to the level, their level that they're capable of? Or is it the runner who maybe they didn't end up beating their opponent, but they had their best day of all time? And I think it's, it goes to this idea that, to a certain degree, our opponents are a little bit arbitrary, right? We might face somebody who's playing great on that particular day. We might face a higher level player. We might, there can be bad luck. There can be bad sportsmanship. There can be all sorts of different things that can happen out there, that are out of our control, that are, again, a little bit arbitrary. So judging ourselves just based on that end result isn't actually fair. It doesn't actually reflect it doesn't actually reflect whether it was a productive or successful performance out there or not, right? It simply is, almost like a grade on our performance, but doesn't fully tell the whole picture. And I think this idea of, failure or feedback, I think we can look at losses, or really any situation, wins as well, as feedback, right? We can take it in, we can learn from it, we can understand what went well, what needs work, and be better because of that, because of receiving that feedback, which I think the best in the world do. And there's, as you said, Brian, there's definitely some examples of athletes that have had some great quotes about that. So we can take it as feedback and be better because of it, or we could view it as failure. We can view it as a threat to us as a person, as a threat to our identity, a threat to our ego, and try to avoid it, right? And I think when people try to avoid it, that's when we see things like people not playing in tournaments, people quitting, people burning out. Even within a match, things like tanking can happen, which I think often happen. Somebody tanks and then they have that as an excuse. They say, oh, well, I didn't lose because I was the weaker player. I lost because I tanked, or I lost because my opponent made those couple of bad line calls earlier in that match. And, instead of fully putting ourselves out there, maybe winning or losing the match, but risking that potential bruise to our ego if we end up losing, because we view it as failure, and we view it as somehow that's, a situation where we've really fallen short, rather than just viewing it as, okay, I lost this match, but look at all these different things that I learned from it. And there's there's some great quotes from Kobe Bryant or Giannis. I'm sure I'll mispronounce his last name, so maybe I shouldn't even try. Um, from the NBA, where I think, with Giannis, it was after a playoff loss, and they were asking him, sort of how he, does he view this season as a failure? And he kind of pauses and laughs a little bit and says, "No, I don't. I'm not going to view it in that way, right? I mean, there's many NBA teams. Only one can win the championship each year, and just because we didn't end up winning the championship for one reason or the other, I'm not gonna I'm not going to just believe that that's a failure." He talks about, he brought up Michael Jordan. And he said, hey, he I think won what, six championships. But there were many years that his teams didn't. So was each of those years a failure? I mean, and we can bring the same to tennis, right? I mean, we think about Novak and Rafa and Roger and Serena and some of the greats. And yeah, when we think about their incredible achievements, does that mean that they failed every time they lost in a final or every time they didn't win a Grand Slam tournament? So no, I really like that, and there's great quotes from Kobe Bryant as well, where he talks about viewing it all as as feedback, as just opportunities for him to get better, which I think also relates to different points that we've talked about. That idea of everything is practice, right? That everything we every situation we have is simply practice, is simply an opportunity for us to get better at it for next time, for the future as well. So I think that there's a lot there in terms of top athletes quotes and about sort of this idea as a whole. But I wanted to see some of your thoughts on that idea.
I think first of all, success and failure, they're abstract concepts that everyone gets to define for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
If an athlete or a coach wants to define it through achievements and outcomes, that's fine. You can do that. I think, as we've said on this show, there are many ways to success, but not all of them are the healthiest ways. And I think what we're trying to promote here today is different ways of thinking that we believe are going to be healthier for your mental and emotional states as a player. So when we think of something like failure, Josh, I think first of all, I just have a problem with how the word is used in modern day society. I feel as if we are using that word as a very judgmental and harsh way of describing something that could be described more objectively. It's a loss. Why is that a failure? Simply a loss. Losses are normal. Or it's a mistake. Why is that a failure? Why are we putting this sort of overloaded term on these things when we could simply look at it more rationally and objectively? It's like, okay, I lost that match, or I made a mistake, or we didn't win. Our team did not win the conference championship. Again, if you want to define success and failure based on winning, that's purely up to you, and that might work for you. But I think in most cases, that gets in the way of the long-term perspective of trying to become the best you can become. Because now you're trying to manipulate things to create a result that you don't fully control, instead of working on yourself and learning and improving and becoming the best you can become. This is where I think there's a good video about failure doesn't exist, and it's a short excerpt from an interview that Kobe Bryant did years ago with Jamel Hill, where he talks about the fact that he's not playing not to lose. He's not playing just to win. He's playing to figure things out. He's playing to learn. So every experience is all about him improving his process and what he does. And one of the reasons that he talks about failure not existing is because there's always another practice. There's always another game. There's always tomorrow. So as he said, the story continues. None of these results are permanent, unless, of course, you decide to take a result, look at it, and then quit, or decide not to learn from it. That, yes, you could probably more objectively call that a failure, because you stopped before you had a chance to reach your highest potential, whatever that could be. And I think Giannis Antetokounmpo also had very similar points. And in fact, if somebody watches that press conference, you'll see him actually get a little bit upset. He's a little bit exasperated with this particular reporter who he's known already. He had a relationship with this guy. And I think it's a very similar message. It's like, no, in sports, we just continue. We're always building on the last experience. And it's not about having to win and calling ourselves successful. It's about learning and improving all the way through. And there's always another game. There's always another tomorrow, especially for most of us who play tennis. This is a lifetime sport. We can continue to get better and better through a very, late age in our lives. So the more I think that we can put aside the word failure, put aside the verb to fail, and look at this stuff more objectively as, yeah, I lost, or yeah, I made a mistake, but what do I want to learn from this? What did I maybe figure out? What became a little bit more clear? In your example of the runner, Josh, even the person who won, maybe there's a positive there. Maybe for whatever reason, that runner just didn't have the same energy today, but you know what? He gutted it out.
Yep.
Maybe he was able to deal with the fact that his energy was lower, and perhaps his being more experienced is what led him to actually win. So there might be some level of pride there that, hey, you know what? I did what I could based on what I had. We don't know the full story, but that could be an example too. That happens a lot. I'm working with a college player who had a recent match in which his body was cramping. And if you were to watch the match without knowing that, you'd be like, what is this guy doing? Why is he hitting the ball this way? It looks like he's afraid to lose. Now, he was doing the best he could with what he had. And he gutted out a super tiebreak win for the third set with his hand and arm cramping. That's something to look back on and say, you know what, that's good. All right, certainly aesthetically, not your best performance, but from a competitive perspective, that was great. That's a good match. What did we learn from that? We don't get too excited about it, because then when we do get too excited about these things, we end up creating expectations of having to do it again and again
Yep.
and again. And that's not realistic either in a sport like tennis. So can we simply look at every experience as a learning opportunity on our journey to becoming the best? I would certainly encourage people to look up videos on Kobe, how failure doesn't exist, or Giannis's press conference from a few years ago where he's asked that question, because they're really great perspectives. And these guys, these are the elite. We want to listen to the elite when they talk about stuff like that. 99% of the rest of the competitive world isn't saying this, but they are. So we want to understand how they think, because people who are high performers, elite performers, they do think differently. And this is part of maybe giving everybody a little bit of a cheat code on how to think about this stuff. Don't over identify with results. Don't use the word to fail or failure. Simply look at things objectively, keep learning, keep trying to figure things out. Use your self-awareness and observation abilities to help you do that.
And it's a little bit paradoxical where it actually ends up being some of those best athletes of all time that have that perspective, right? Which I think we think makes sense, because it tends to lead to better and better results, right? Where it's, instead of this fixation on results and that being everything and them defining us and us viewing losses as failures, and wins as successes, without us being aware enough of ourselves and of the situation to maybe see it, a little bit deeper than that. I think, yeah, the what can separate sort of that 1% of athletes from the rest is this way of seeing it, right? Where instead, if somebody views, if somebody takes more of that self-centered or ego approach and they win a tournament, let's say, or they have some sort of success in their minds, why would they put themselves out there again and risk that? Because in their minds, they are risking that way that they're currently feeling about themselves. They're risking that success that they currently have, right? So it almost wouldn't be logical for them to continue to put themselves out there and take that risk. Where instead, if we're viewing everything as practice, or we're viewing every loss, let's say, as feedback, then we're eager to put ourselves out there. We're eager to get more feedback because, just like Kobe talks about, it's necessary. It's necessary to help him learn, to help him get better. To he's picking up more information, right? And I think it's in a lot of ways that's we can experience that as athletes and as people, right? As we grow older, as we mature, we have more and more experiences, and hopefully we're handling them better now than we would have in the past, right? And that's definitely true on the tennis court and true in other areas of life. And to me, that in a lot of ways, that is success, right? That we've learned from our experiences, that we've grown, that we've gotten better, that we're handling them better now than we would have a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. Because we're, and that's us maturing as people and as tennis players, right? Us maturing as tennis players is not just that we're able to serve bigger or, hit our forehand with more pace or more spin or whatever it may be. It's that we are a more complete player by developing different aspects of our game and different aspects of us as people.
For sure. So I think if we begin to wrap it up, Josh, and put this selection from Inner Excellence together, we're trying to connect this idea of we all have to go through this trap of self-centeredness and focusing on ourselves and maybe trying to help our own insecurities around it, but we can get through it by being able to develop some awareness. Mindfulness can help, or simply reflecting on things, stepping back, and then developing better definitions for ourselves about what success and failure are, and um, looking at things more objectively so that we can kind of learn and grow and um, really use mastery in our tennis project as the purpose. I think we had an episode on purpose-based identity versus performance-based identity. I think that this marries up with this concept very well. So, any last thoughts from you?
I would actually go back to a point that I think that you brought up earlier, and just try to underline that or highlight that about the only real failure is giving up, right? I mean, understanding that everybody, including the best in the world, have have lost, and that's you can't get to the highest level of the game without losing a tremendous amount of times. In fact, so the losses themselves are not the issue. The issue is the judgment around the loss, the way that we're viewing that in regards to our identity and our ego. Um, and then ultimately, if we take that loss or we take that, that sort of judgment of our performance and make a decision of, okay, I'm going to stop playing, or why even play, or things like that, based on that, right? Again, to lose is normal. You as If you are going to compete as a tennis player, you will win plenty and lose plenty over your career, and that happens to everybody. And that no part of me saying that means that you shouldn't try your hardest or you shouldn't work to be the best player you can, because you absolutely should. But it's about how we're viewing those situations. Are we viewing those losses as failure and as a reason why why we should stop or why we should give up, or are we viewing it simply a as a source of our potential improvements, right? Okay, because I had this match today, which I lost, I now understand that I need to make more first serves. I now understand that I need to control my emotions. I now understand that when I'm up 5-2 in the tiebreak and I feel tense and I tell myself, oh, let's just make the ball in, that I need to counteract that in some way. So, and again, I wouldn't have known any of that had I not played this match, had I not lost that match, right? But since I did play that match, I learned these things, and hopefully next time I play, I can be a bit better. But if I'm not, or if I lose that next time, guess what? I'm going to take that same sort of approach And I think what this approach does is it gives us this ability to keep striving to get better, where it's not just about some arbitrary finish line. Like, I want to win this match today. That's the finish line. Or I want to, be this level UTR, or I want to be a 4.0 player, or play in college tennis, right? Instead of sort of this arbitrary line, which again could be somebody's goal, it's I want to be the best player I can be. And part of being the best player you can be is overcoming those ups and downs, those wins, those losses. But I think if they're viewed in the right way, they you can get quite a bit more out of them. So yeah, that's the final point that I would make.
And I think if you can also have an attitude of gratitude towards some of those things, I can think of just some losses I had that felt unpleasant in the moment, but were necessary for growth. And looking back, I'm grateful that they happened
Yep.
because they opened up my mind to something that needed to be dealt with. And I did deal with it. And I got better because of that. So be grateful for some of these difficult experiences. They don't define you. It's really how you respond to them. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you are enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.